All right, so we're going to continue talking about energy today. So last we had left with that work energy theorem. Now, some of you did send me some emails. If I haven't responded to you right now, I apologize. Page 115. Okay. If I haven't responded to you, I apologize. I was in lab all day yesterday afternoon, and then I was in lab all morning this morning. I sent some of you saying I'll respond to you after class today. So if I haven't responded to you, I will respond to you today after class. I just haven't gotten a chance to. We've been doing intensive labs for the group getting ready to go out in clinics. So it's not that I'm ignoring you. You'll get responded to today. So we had talked about, the transfer of heat, how, when energies change, it doesn't actually disappear. It usually just changes form. We talked about how speed of an object actually affects its overall, impact velocity, how much energy is transferred, everything like that. That comes into play even when you're dealing with exercises and that, which we'll talk about. So in this case here, the question from the book was, when you do 100 joules of work on a moving cart, does it mean that the cart gains 100 joules of energy? Well, maybe not, because we've got to still take into account that kinetic effect of friction, the friction rubbing on those wheels, or if it doesn't have wheels in the bottom of the cart, right? It'll depend upon the net work done on it with the loss to friction. So it may gain 80 joules of kinetic energy, right? And it's, you start pushing on it, it's going to start gaining speed, and it's going to get more kinetic energy as you add more and more to it. But just because you do 100 joules of work on the cart doesn't necessarily mean the cart is going to gain that full 100 joules. I can do joules of work on just this stress ball that I have here, because if I just drop it, right, that potential energy, the gravitational potential energy, is going to convert into kinetic energy as it moves. As it falls, when it starts up here, it's 100% potential energy, right? Because it's not moving. When it falls 1/4 of the way down, 1/4 of that has converted to kinetic energy, still about 3/4 potential. Halfway, you're about half and half. 3/4 of the way, you're now more kinetic than potential. And then until you hit the impact, that's when all that potential energy now becomes kinetic energy. And this one happens to bounce when it hits, right? And we learned before that when it bounces, it's delivering most of its kinetic energy into the surface it's bouncing off of. Excuse me. We talked about that with the flower pot, that if the flower pot bounces on your head, you're more likely to get injured than if the flower pot shatters over your head. And you can usually hear that when a ball hits, if it thumps. That means it's transferred most of its kinetic energy into the object that it hit. And if we had a nice little thermo, like IR camera, we could see that even minutely, this is just a stress ball is all it is. The stress ball area that hit the table probably got a little warm from friction. So some of that energy was transferred over to friction upon impact.
So, Mr. McKeever,
Yep.
what you're saying is basically if it has potential energy, it doesn't fully transform into kinetic energy until it fully passes that kinetic energy into something else.
Yep. So let me do a little drawing here. This is where it's going to get scary, because Mr. McKeever is going to draw. This is actually a good slide for it. So up here, I have my ball, right? And when it's up here, it's 100% potential energy. We're going to say that it's, let's change colors here. And let's say that's a really good straight line there, Mr. McKeever. Let's say this is 4 feet. So we'll say, let's change that because we deal in meters. So it's about 1 meter from the ground, right? Up here, it's 100% potential energy as it's just sitting, right? And the potential energy is from the gravity, mgv, right? So it's just got that up there. As that ball drops, if we could split this into 4 even sections, and we'll call this 1/4 of the way down. We'll call this 1/2 of the way down. This way, 3/4 of the way down. And then down here, obviously 4/4 of the whole way. That's hitting the desk. So this is the desk down here. See, this is why I don't draw very often. As that ball falls and starts speeding up, when it gets to this 1/4 part, 1/4 about of its potential energy has now been converted into kinetic energy, because it's starting to speed up, right? We learned that with learning how fast something falls. So when it gets about here, we're at about, 25% kinetic. And that means the rest is what still?
Potential.
Rest is still potential, right? Yeah, the rest is still potential. So it still has some potential, right? So that means if I would stop it before it hits the ground, right? If I stopped it at that quarter mark, come back here. You're my example. If I stopped it, I'm only going to get about 25% of that total gravitational energy imparted into my hand. Does that make sense? Because it hasn't fallen the whole way to the desk. Now, we could also figure it out from the hand as well, and that would totally change the formula. But looking at the formula we have drawn out here, if I'm about a quarter of the way to the desk, only 25% of that energy is going to be imparted into my hand. When we go down another quarter, now what's happened? How much kinetic energy do we have at about the halfway point?
50?
Yeah, we'd have about 50. So with the example, the car's PE would be converted to kinetic energy as friction in the ground. Yep, as it slows down. Yep, we're going to talk about that in a second here. So at this point, we're 50-50, right? So now if I come down, so say I come down to here, because I dropped about another quarter, the ball definitely feels different hitting my hand, right? Because it's gained momentum. It's sped up as it's fallen down. So now instead of me getting 25% kinetic energy, I'm now getting about 50%. Now, if I drop down further, now I'm about 3/4 way. I'm almost to the desk. At that point, I'm 75% kinetic and 25% potential. Draw, thank you. So now here's quarter, here's half. Now I'm kind of down here. Let me see if I can tilt the camera down some. Exactly. I don't know who's having fun, but they're having more fun than me. Boom. Now that definitely feels a lot different than when it was up here. Because now that ball's got a little bit more speed as it's falling, right? The velocity is increased. Let's say that instead of it being a ball, we're dropping something like a really piece of fragile glass. If I can catch that up here, it might not break, right? But maybe down here at that 75% point, because it's now gained so much speed, it might actually break on me, right? And if you have any kids or you work with any kids on Lego, you'll see this happen when they drop Legos or knock Legos off the desk. If it falls a little ways, the Legos kind of stay together. If it falls a good distance off a desk, usually Legos kind of explode into pieces of shards all over the floor that eventually some parent is going to step on. By the time it gets down and it actually now strikes the desk, all of this potential energy has now become kinetic. And theoretically, the ball, if it didn't have elasticity, because it bounces, right? If it didn't have elasticity, it would stop and just sit at the desk. At that point, all of that kinetic energy is being imparted upon the desk. Now, just because it's imparting all its kinetic energy into the desk doesn't mean the desk gets all that kinetic energy. Because some of it's going to be lost to friction, right? The ball's going to heat up, the desk is going to heat up. We're going to lose some of that kinetic energy to friction. It's going to transform. But if you're able to calculate how much energy the desk gains and how much is lost to friction, it would add up to all of that potential energy at the very top. Does that make sense? Did I lose anyone yet?
Makes sense.
So that just kind of think, and you think about it, like if you've ever, I've been a server before, I've worked in restaurants. When you drop stuff, you usually try to catch it before it hits the floor, right? Because the moment it hits the floor, everyone starts clapping at you because it probably broke and shattered everywhere, right? But maybe if you can catch it, you only get the food all over yourself, you don't break the dish. Or you're reaching for something in the upper cabinet and you grab that nice fancy wine glass and all of a sudden it tips out. If you can catch it, you've reduced it and you're only imparting part of that potential energy it has. Now, when this ball comes to rest on this desk, it regains a different potential energy at that point because it's back to rest. It has no more room to fall, right? So it's at 0, but I could roll it out here to the edge of the desk, and now it could develop a new potential energy that falls a new distance, because potential energy is based upon its gravitational position relative to another object. I have a potential energy relative to the floor. We also theoretically would have a potential energy relative to Earth's core. If we could walk over to a hole that goes all the way down to the Earth's core, and we stand on that hole, we're not just going to float there, we're going to fall all the way down that hole.
So Makira, I got a question.
Certainly.
So like if the ball bounces, is the table providing any like energy, or is that more just for elasticity of the
Well,
ball?
in this case, yeah. So in this case, really what we'd have, if we're going to really add all that together, we'd have to add the amount of energy that the ball retains to bounce, right? Because it's going to retain some of that kinetic energy. That's what allows it to go back up. And then it gains more potential energy and then comes back down, right? So we could theoretically, this is a really bad example because this one doesn't drop. But if I take my wallet's a great example, right? My wallet, I drop it, it stops. It doesn't bounce. That's because it's full of money and I'm just rich. Just joking. Has nothing to do with that.
So it's not like when it hits the ball, like the table is not using or at least giving out.
It's not going to give the ball any energy. The ball's just not going to give off all of it. So that's the elastic ball makes it a little more difficult because of the fact it's got that rebound effect. And again, when you get to there, when I remember I said that slide before, understanding that kind of elastic physics is really getting up into the high level. I'm not going to ask you a question like that on your quiz. That's way too hard. But what I might ask you is, you know, you have a ball that's 5 meters off of a table and you drop it. At 2.5 meters, what is the split between kinetic and potential energy? Well, 2.5 meters is halfway, right? So it'd be 50% kinetic, 50% potential. That make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Or I may ask, you know, when a rock hits the ground, how much of its potential energy is it imparting to the ground via kinetic energy? Theoretically, it's 100% minus the friction, right?
So how do we go about the whole friction thing? I'm kind of confused on that.
Right, and when the friction, and again, when I get there, so let me tilt myself back up so you're not looking straight at my stomach. Would be good. So when we get to friction, we're not going to separate out friction. But what I could say is, let's say you have 100 joules of energy up here. And you drop it and you have a force plate on the desk. And that force plate registers that 90 joules of energy was transferred to it. I could ask you, where did the other 10 joules of energy go to? And that would have gone to
the friction?
Yep.
Okay.
Right? Now there is, again, quantum level physics, we can actually calculate how much friction is even happening based upon the shape of the object, the weight of the object. I'm not even ready to teach quantum level physics. You guys can, well, let's try to keep it like base level physics if we can, right? But thinking from a therapy perspective, let's say you're walking a patient down the hallway. And you're walking them down the hallway and all of a sudden they're like, oh my God, I'm going to fall. And you know they're going to fall. You have no choice. They're going down no matter what, right? Would it be better to have them kind of lowered to your knee first and then lowered to the ground? Or would it be better to just let them fall?
Lower to the knee and then to the ground?
Because what you're doing then is you're splitting up that potential energy.
Okay.
So they don't deliver that full potential energy into kinetic energy when they hit the ground, which could fracture bones.
Right.
Right. And we'll talk about that in Therax or in rehab on how to kind of create a slide out of your leg so you can kind of slide them down your leg rather than them even falling. Because anytime a patient falls, bad news.
No
right?
bueno.
Yeah, we don't no bueno. No bueno at all. Exactly right.
Thank you.
Yeah. So that's kind of a real life example of it, right? Or if we have a patient that's on the stairs, we know that they're greater risk of breaking a bone because they're higher up. Well, why are they at greater risk? Because they have more potential energy at that height that could be delivered into kinetic energy if they fall, which would fracture a bone. That's really how physics kind of relates to it, is we know the higher up we are, the more we're going to break a bone, right? Or thinking back to something like You know, because I've got an example coming up here that's kind of morbid. I don't know why the book put this example in, but people jumping out of a building, right? And I can relate to back to 9/11. I know for some of you guys, 9/11 was a history lesson. For me, I lived it. I was back at that point. And I was working in IT in that point, and one of our main buildings was in building 2. We lost that building. We lost a lot of people in that building. But you saw people jumping out of the building, right? And people would look at that and go, why would they jump out of the building? Well, what is their option? Their option was jump out of the building where they potentially know it's a quick death, or to do what?
Get burned alive.
Get burned alive, right? It's a really morbid thing to think about, but they're really using physics at that point, because they know that heat is going to take a lot longer to burn through all of their tissue and cause them slow, agonizing, painful death. Whereas honestly, most of the people, and there's actually a study on this from Hartford, at the height that most of those people jumped out of, they were dead before they hit the ground because they had a heart attack halfway down. Because they were falling so fast, it just caused them, they got so scared they had a heart attack. Right? But when you're thinking about those buildings with how high they are, there's absolutely no air mattress, there's no trampoline, there's nothing that a fire department could put down there that would have saved those people, right? They have so much kinetic energy by the time they're hitting the ground that there's nothing. And if they did have a trampoline there, guess what would happen? They'd probably go up twice as, back up to close to the height and come back down, and it'd be bad news anyway, right? It's a morbid thought, but that really is, I mean, people were making that decision in a heartbeat going, man, my choice is either burn to death or splatter. And that's kind of scary to think about. I always laughed. I'm like, I don't understand why in the military they make you jump out of perfectly good airplanes. I think it's to scare you, right? So here we have brakes of a car. The car's locked, so they're skidding, right? And we're going to talk old cars here, because new cars wouldn't skid, because most new cars have what to stop them from skidding?
Anti-lock brakes.
Anti-lock brakes, right? Which is a physics term, right? Anti-lock brakes are actually a really neat piece of physics, because what they do is if you stomp on the pedal, that's locking your brakes up. But instead, what the brakes will do is they'll slowly pump on and off. And what they're doing is reducing that kinetic energy slowly, right? It's actually just nothing more than a physics problem. But here we got a car skid into a hall. It's an old car. Let's just say it's like an old Pinto or something, right? The car skids to a stop. How much farther will the car skid if it's moving 3 times as fast? Well, we know that velocity, when we're talking about it, right? Velocity is 1/2 mv squared. If we triple the velocity, that means it's going to go 9 times further, right? Because that's going to be squared as well. Because that's going to go in here with the velocity. And if it's in here with the velocity, that means your v is squared and your 3 is squared. That means it's going to take 9 times as much kinetic energy taken off of it in order to stop it. Or it'll take probably 9 times farther to stop than a car that's going not as fast as that. This is why it's, again, so difficult if you're going 50 miles an hour to come to an immediate stop. Right? Do you ever have one of those moments you're out on like I-95 or the 15 and you're kind of out of it, and then you look up and suddenly the cars are at a dead standstill in front of you? And you do one of those, oh my God, brakes, and hopefully your car stops. If not, over to the side of the current road, or it'd be better for you to slide to the side of the road than it would be to impact the car in front of you, because you're going to deliver all that kinetic energy into them, which if they can't stop your car, they'll deliver all that kinetic energy into the car in front of them, and you'll create that chain reaction domino effect that everyone loves on the freeway, right? That's those accidents that, two cars get in an accident, they can move off the freeway. When you have that nice 3 or 4 car pile up, then that freeway is messed up for a couple hours till they get all the cars out of there.
Mr.
Yeah, parentheses should not be in the second one. Thank you. It should be there. No parentheses here. Because we've already squared it. Thank you for catching that.
When it says the car is moving 3 times as fast. 3 times as fast as what?
So just in general, so let's say we have car A, it's going 10 miles an hour. If car B is going 30 miles an hour, it's going 3 times as fast as another car. Just 3 times as fast as something else.
So is this formula for like comparison?
You could, absolutely. So we could compare, we have our, let me clear this so I can get a new drawing, right? We know that our formula is 1/2 mv squared, right? That's the formula. I could give you theoretically, and I don't think I do this as far as calculating, but I could give you a car's mass and its velocity, and then compare it to another car that's going, that maybe has a different mass or a different velocity, and ask you which has more kinetic energy. But the main part about this that I want to get from you guys is the mass is important. The velocity is by far more important because the speed is squared. If we have 2 cars that weigh, let's just clean this off here because I want to get actual writing, because writing is much better. Where'd my mouse go? Mouse went all the way over there. Joy of having 4 monitors, right? So if we have one car that weighs, let's say it weighs 10 kilograms. We have another car that weighs 10 kilograms. So we have 2 cars at 10 kilograms. If car A is going at 1 meter per second versus car B that's going at 10 meters per second, that car B is going to be going exponentially more with kinetic energy than car A, because that 10 is going to end up being squared, right? So we could plug these in, right? We could say, go down here. So we'll talk with car A. We'll label this here so it makes sense. There's car A. There's car B. We theoretically could do a comparison by just going 1/2 mv squared. Let's raise the second. There we go. So if we're doing car A, we plugged it in, we'd have 1/2 10 kilograms, right? And its velocity is 1 meter per second squared. So we're going to end up with how much kinetic energy, which is measured in joules, right? So if we take 1/2 times 10, we have what? 5, right? And 1 meter per second squared is still 1, right? 1 squared is 1. So we end up with car A having about 5 joules of energy. And I'm at 1 kilogram. These aren't real cars. 10 kilograms, these aren't real cars. These are like box cars. That would be a really tiny car. But look at the difference in energy that car B has. Putting the same formula in here. I can write today. So we have the same mass, right? 10 kilograms. Now our velocity is 10 meters per second squared. So that 10 meters per second squared is going to become what? 100. 10 times 10 is 100. So what we'll end up having here, if we take the 1/2 times 10, we'll have 5 times 100. And now car B actually has 500 joules of energy, just because of that small change in velocity, right? 1 meter per second versus 10 meters per second, not a huge change in speed, really. It isn't. I mean, in the grand scheme of things, that's not a huge change in speed. But 5 joules versus 500 joules, that a big change in energy? Yeah. Right? So now one of these hits a wall and the other hits the wall. B is definitely more likely to cause more damage, right? Because it's got more energy to impart. It'd be the same idea here, right? So I have 2 different items here. I have a brain. That's a squeegee. I have lots of stress balls because I'm stressed. This weighs almost nothing. It's air, right? This weighs probably a good pound, this stress ball here. When I drop them, which one is going to impart more energy to the desk? The lighter one or the heavier one?
Heavier? The lighter one.
The heavier. They're going to fall at the same speed, right? They're both going to fall at that G, right? Gravity. But because this one has a little bit more mass, it's going to impart more energy because that's effective. Now, what happens if I drop this one, But this one I throw down. I've now increased its what?
Velocity.
Velocity. Now which one's going to probably have more kinetic energy?
The lighter one.
Yeah, the lighter one. Even though it's significantly lighter, I mean, that thing literally weighs maybe a quarter of an ounce, right? But because it's imparted a greater velocity, it's going to deliver more kinetic energy. And you saw it when bouncing across and somewhere else in my office now. I'll find it later, probably step on it. But does that make sense? That's kind of the level I want you to get with this. I'm not going to really, we could do this formula, right? But just as easily, if I just give you that mass and that velocity, you should be able to just look at that and go, man, that velocity is pretty big. That car B has more kinetic energy because of the velocity being squared. Without even having to calculate, you could if you wanted to, right? And I'll be honest, this is how, when I took my ASVAB, which is the military entrance exam, this is how I got through a lot of my ASVAB. I didn't calculate most of the physics questions. I just had to know the formulas and knew how they applied to what I was doing. I'm 100% honest. I didn't do half the questions on that test. Somehow or other, I was still qualified.
Mr. McKeever,
Here I'm Mr. McKeever, yes.
for this formula down at the bottom,
Mhm.
I'm confused how you get like the end result where it's 9, 1/2, and then
Yeah.
NV2.
Yep, so let me clarify that a little bit here. Let's do that first of all.
That's
Right? So our formula is 1/2 mv squared. What the question is asking is, you have a car that's traveling, the car was traveling at 1 speed and it skidded to a stop, but now it's traveling at a speed that's 3 times as great. How much more kinetic energy is going to deliver? How much faster is it going to travel because it's going 3 times as fast? What this is saying is, I'm plugging this in. I don't like this equal sign here. I'm just going to plug it in. It changes the form. Oh my God, let me write. This mouse is just not cooperating today. So we had 1/2 mv squared as the formula, right? When I'm looking at these theoretical comparisons, it's a little easier to put things in parentheses just so you can think about them. What the question is saying is, this was the first skid. In the second skid, the car is actually traveling, and really it'd be better like this. 3 times, not 2 times. That was good, Mr. McKeever. Now I'm confusing everybody. 3 times as fast. What it's saying is, because it's traveling 3 times as fast, and because this 3 is in here with the velocity, it gets squared just like the velocity. So I don't, this down here, I don't really like the way, that's the way the book words it. But what it's literally saying is m9, and you still have v raised to the square. So looking at the original skid, right? This answer is going to be a factor of 9 greater than the original skid. So it's either going to require 9 times as much kinetic energy to stop it, or it's going to skid what? 9 times farther. Does that help it?
I think so. I just have to take
Internalize it.
Yeah.
So don't think too much about this, okay? Because I'm not going to give you a hard, you have to know the formula, obviously, right? But in this case, this would be very similar to what the question would look like. It would say, if the car is traveling 3 times as fast, how much farther would it skid? Or how much more kinetic energy would it require to stop it? And that would be 9 times as far or 9 times as much kinetic energy, because you had to square that 3. Let's change it and say, instead, on the second skid, now let's get rid of this down here. On the second skid here, the car is going 4 times as fast. Right, so now we're on a second skid, and now it's going 4. So you were going 10 miles an hour the first time, you're now going 40 miles an hour. And we're not even trying to really hard calculate this formula out. We could, if we had the mass of the car and we had the velocity converted to meters per second. But the car is now traveling 4 times as fast. How much more kinetic energy will it have, or how much farther would it skid in that skid? Does anyone have a guess? We're going to square the 4. It's okay. So 4 times 4 is
16.
16, right? So now 1/2 m. I'm just going to separate these out just because it makes it a little clearer. So now, no matter what, this car was actually going at, let me get my little marker here so I can actually draw now. This car up here has no factor in front of this velocity. This car now has this 16 times more kinetic energy delivered to it. Just by going, what was that, 10 miles an hour faster than a 30-mile-an-hour car? That's a huge, that's why this, what the point of this lesson here, the point of this part is showing that velocity is an exponential increaser in kinetic energy, right? Because it has an exponent, velocity squared. We could change that. We could change that even. What happened? Oh, that's not what I want to do. We'll move this over here. Let's say instead now we've got a car that's going 100 times faster. So now your original car was going 1 mile an hour, and now the car is going 100 miles an hour. How much more kinetic energy is it going to have?
10,000.
Yeah, right. It's going to be 100 times 100. So it's going to have 10,000 the amount of kinetic energy. 10,000 times. So we're going to have this now. That's a huge increase, right? From going from 4 times to this, good Lord. Right. That's why when you see, if you've ever gotten involved with EMT, if you ever worked in EMT or you worked in emergency rescue, the worst accidents to see are those people that are speeding. You know, especially, you know, there was just one a few days ago where the guy was going like 140 down on the 215 and hit the center divide. Right? Because his velocity was so great, he had a ton of kinetic energy. At that point, it really didn't matter what car he had. It was getting what? Demolished. Right? The only thing that probably saved him is he probably had some sort of a fancy sports car that had a ton of safety features in it because the guy walked away from it. Now let's go back to the 1960s. And we'll put this guy in a, 1969 Mustang Fastback, and he's going that same speed. Probably a good chance he's not going to live through that crash because it just doesn't have the safety features of modern cars. Now, it might live a little better. Actually, the concrete barrier might be destroyed because the car is 10 tons of rolling steel. But now he's got a greater mass on top of having the velocity, and that just makes it 10 times worse. So what if, instead of doing this, I'm going to delete this one, it'll go away, clear. So if I asked you a question, which has a greater impact on kinetic energy in a moving object, velocity or mass? Your answer would be
Velocity.
velocity. There you go. That might just be one of the bonus quiz questions. Gee, or not bonus, one of the quiz questions, right? Because if you think about it, imagine how much you'd have to take that mass up in order to equate out to a small change in velocity, right? It would be a dramatic, you'd have to take the mass up 4 times to take one change in velocity to go from a 1 time to a 2 times speed. So you'd have to take a car from being 2,000 pounds to being 4,000 pounds to affect things the same way. And more than likely, you're more likely to increase your speed or decrease your speed versus making your car lighter or faster.
And you said that was for kinetic energy?
Kinetic energy, yeah.
Okay. What would be the opposite for potential?
So for potential, we could have the same idea because velocity is not going to. So if we're talking with potential now, we got to talk about whether it's chemical, elastic, or gravitational. But if we're just talking gravitational, right? Does the speed of something dropping ever really change? The speed of something dropping is always going to be the force of gravity on the object, right?
Mhm.
So gravity on the object operates at about 10 meters per second squared. At that point, in order to gain more kinetic energy at the bottom, you'd have to make the object heavier because the speed isn't going to change unless I physically throw it.
Mhm.
But we're not even talking about that. So I could theoretically increase it, and now it's bound. I'm trying to get it. It won't bounce high enough. Now it's gone. I've lost my toy. Right?
Yes.
Because the speed now, I could also, now if I took that ball here and then I took it to Jupiter, where Jupiter has a much greater, I think it's 2.7 times the gravitational constant. That means when it hits, that 2.7 would be squared. So we'd be talking about, what about 6-ish times as much kinetic energy hitting the desk. Might break the desk. Right? And Jupiter, none of us are walking around. I'm just saying. A lot of space shows get it wrong. I saw one the other day where people were walking on Jupiter. They're like, nope, that doesn't happen. Yes.
Is gravity not like acceleration?
Gravity would be in this. So if we're talking about, if we were trying to calculate how much kinetic energy it had down here, we would do that just by using our our gravitational constant for our acceleration, right? And we could calculate if it falls from here, how fast it's going when it hits, and use that to calculate kinetic energy. And that kinetic energy would actually equal, theoretically, the potential energy it has up here. Does that make sense?
Okay, thank you.
I know it's a concept, but don't totally freak out about the concept. I'm not gonna go that far in depth. That was good. Good questions. Thank you. I don't need to write anymore. Go away writing. Oh, I went too far. So that's where we were. So now here's something that actually does apply to our real life. Energy efficiency, right? Like all this stuff we're learning about Mr. Keeper, I don't care about. Energy efficiency, we should all care about, right? How many of you guys use LED light bulbs in your house? Right? All my lights are LED now at this point. You can't see, but behind my desk, I have purple LEDs all across my wall. That's what gives me this lovely purple tint. Purple is by far my favorite color. You'll find that quick. Why do we use LED bulbs now?
More energy efficient.
Right. They're more energy efficient. What that means is the energy that's going into the bulb from your wall socket is actually being converted into light versus those old incandescent bulbs, right? The old school light bulbs. What is given off on most of those? Heat. Right? If you get one of the old school, something from like the 1970s and you feel how much heat's off those light bulbs, it's quite a bit. But even at that point, there's no incandescent bulb that is going to be as energy efficient as an LED. Just because LEDs are that much better at converting that energy into light. Now, there's a side effect to that because some of the LEDs have toxic gases in them. Like the old CFL bulbs we had before we had the LED bulbs. Did anyone ever have those, the little curlicue bulbs? Right? If you open them up, they had a mixture of a lead radon gas in them. Not the best for you to be breathing in. And if any of them ever broke in your house, you had that weird funky smell that went along with it. That was kind of that gas being let off. But they were still more efficient than the incandescent bulbs. Why do schools and hospitals and all these places use those beautiful halogen bulbs that make you look so awesome when you're at work? They give you that nice pale glow because halogen bulbs are efficient, right? It's a gas, it's cheap to make, and they're really energy efficient. So energy efficiency is looking at, well, how much energy gets put into something gives out what you want it to be. Does that make sense? So looking at machines here, right? Some energy is converted into molecular energy. Some of it's converted into heat because we've got friction, right? In the real world, no real machine is 100% energy efficient, even ourselves. Like right now, I'm feeling better, but I was running around getting everything set up for this class, and I was putting off a lot of heat. And I'm starting to get better now, so I don't like being warm. But our bodies aren't 100% energy efficient. We put off heat. Even though we're burning calories to perform a task, some of that calories that we use gets put off in heat. It also gets put off in moving molecules around, right? Causing your blood to flow, your heart to pump. But even our heart's not 100% efficient. If we could have a 100% efficient heart, man, that would be fantastic. Even some of the best athletes don't only ever get up to like 90% efficiency on the heart. So like when a real machine here, we have simple lever lifts a rock, right? Or a pulley turns around its axis. A small amount of whatever force you put into it, whatever energy you push, is going to be converted to friction via thermal energy, right? The main thing I want you here, so if we look here, this is the formula up top here for calculating efficiency. It's going to be a percentage, right? So if I put, so we have work input. So if I put 100 joules into something, right? And the amount of work it does is 10 joules, is that very efficient? No, right? That's only about 10% efficient. You wouldn't want that in a car, right? What would that do to your miles per gallon in your car?
Be so much money.
Yeah, right? All of the oil factories will be thanking you every day you pump gas into it, right? My truck is an excellent example of that. I give up some efficiency for power, right? In order for my truck to haul stuff, I'm going to lose some. If you go look at trucks and you look at truck miles per gallon versus car miles per gallon, you're like 32:10. What? Right? And then you add the supercharger I have on my truck, and it goes from like 32 to 6. My vehicle is not very efficient. But then you look at Dr. Ovreskin, and I don't know how many of you guys have been on campus when she's been there, but she has a Prius. And we are like the polar opposites of each other, parking beside each other, because her car is very energy efficient. A lot of the energy that gets put into it gets put out as work. So Priuses and most of the electric cars, but here's the funny thing, most of them are still only about 60% efficient. And we consider that good. Well, it is compared to a truck that gets 15% efficiency, right? It just tells us how useful an object is, or how useful a machine is to us. Let's say you're looking to build a house, and you're putting in a new air conditioning system. Would you want that air conditioner to be efficient? Right, you would. So what would be an efficient air conditioner? It would be one that cools using what? The least amount of electricity, in this area at least, because that's what we use to power everything here, right? Electricity for everything. Could you help your air conditioner's efficiency? What could you do to the house? Solar panels, good. There we go, right? Now you're adding some power in that it didn't have.
Doesn't insulation help with that too?
There we go. You could add insulation, or you could add tinted windows, as Joe said. All of that comes into play. My truck has very, very dark ceramic tinted windows because I hate getting in my truck and it feeling like it's 1,000 degrees because my truck is black. The worst choice in the world for a color for a car to live here in Vegas. Right? But I lived in Pennsylvania. It was actually good in the winter to have a black car because then you weren't freezing in the truck. But if you can help cut down the energy loss, you can actually make an engine more efficient, right? For any of you guys that are into cars here, making modifications to cars can have one effect or the other. It can either make it more efficient, or by adding more power, you may actually make it less efficient, right? That's what car dealerships have to look at, and car dealership manufacturers have to look at, because now they have efficiency standards, right? It used to be they could pump out whatever car they want, but now they have certain efficiency standards they have to meet in order to cut down on what? carbon emissions, because carbon emissions cause the greenhouse gas effect occur, and then we heat up and Mr. McKeever is not happy. And eventually here in Vegas, we'll have daytime summer temperatures in the 130s. That'll be fun, right? So if we put 100 joules of work on a lever and get 90 joules out, you get about a 98% efficiency. Well, what happens to that 2 joules? It's going to be lost as heat from friction most times, right? It may be also lost if the machine we're using isn't efficient for whatever reason. Maybe it doesn't contain the heat. Maybe it doesn't contain the energy. No matter what we do, we're always going to have some loss of friction here on Earth, because we have gravity pulling us down and that resists us. Again, I'm a car guy, so I tend to relate things back to cars. You find I relate things a lot back to cars and to martial arts. That's basically my 2 sticks. But if you go look at the new Mustang, the Fastback, it's got 460 horsepower. Woohoo! Right? That thing's going to get down the road. I love it. I quoted from tire squealing torque that you'll never be at a loss for power. But if you take that same Mustang and you put it on a dynamometer, which is a machine that measures horsepower at the wheels, you'll look at the fancy pony and it only puts out 437. So you'll go to Ford and go, hey, you said my car puts out 460 horsepower, but this says 437. What happened?
Lost to heat.
Yes, lost to heat, right? Because if you know how the motors work, they put off heat, right? If you ever drive for a long distance, if you open your hood, do you want to put your hand on the motor? No, right? Or the old school, if you know that your radiator is overheating, the last thing you want to do is open the radiator. Because at that point, everything in there is under pressure. You're going to get a nice spray of coolant in the face. We're going to lose some of that to heat. Now, in this case, it lost about 23 horsepower, right? Not bad, honestly, in today's average day and age. That's probably going to meet the efficiency standards. I don't know what the official efficiency standards are by the National Highway Trade Safety Association or whatever, whoever measures it. I don't even know who measures it anymore, right? But it'd be one thing to lose those 23. What if you put that car on the dynamometer and instead of getting 437, you only get 200 horsepower? That may clue you in you have a problem with your car, right? Something's escaping. Heat's getting out somewhere. You're not converting engine right. You're not converting fuel right. You're losing power. So that's kind of what we're looking at with efficiency. For the human body, right? Looking at the heart uses a lot of joules of energy. If the heart uses 100 joules, on average, the output you get from the heart is about 60 joules. So you're about 60% efficient on average. There's 65, 85, down to 35, some people, right? But you got to think about this for the heart, so if we talk about energy output or even blood output, the heart can be normally functional down to 30%. So you got to think of how amazing that is. You will be completely or most of the way fine if your heart gets all the way down to 30% in efficiency. It's not until you get down to there until you start seeing symptoms. Now, you may see a few along the way, right? If you have other conditions that go along with it. But if you're a fairly healthy person, that means that heart is pretty impressive as a machine, right? Our human body is designed. I'm in awe every day thinking about some of the stuff I teach about, because the human body is just amazing the way it's designed. And then sometimes we're also stupid, but that's beside the point. So conservation of energy, right? We keep running this theory of conservation. We had it with conservation of momentum in the chapters regarding Newton. Now we have the law of conservation of energy, right? We're also going to have a couple other laws of conservation coming up. The law of conservation of energy, and I put Optimus Prime up here because it fits. Energy cannot be created or destroyed. It can be transformed from one form to another. He's transformed for those who didn't get it. Ha ha ha. That's Mr. McKeever's humor. But the total energy never changes. And if you look at theoretical physics and you go back to the Big Bang, they'll say, I see Diana drinking something there. I assume something in that has calories. right?
It's water.
Oh, it's water, so it doesn't have calories. So somebody's drinking something with calories, you're eating something with calories, right? Theoretical physics would say that if you're eating spaghetti, she got me on that, right? Yeah. If you're eating spaghetti, the calories that were in that spaghetti existed at the time of the Big Bang. They've just transformed in the way the energy has been created. So all matter, all energy has been around. It's just constantly changing form, right? Most important, more than knowing about what energy is how it behaves, how it transforms. And we can understand almost any process occurs in nature if we analyze the transformation of energy. If you buy a piece of property that has a barn on it, and you don't take care of that barn, what eventually happens to the barn?
Dilapidated and collapses.
Yeah, it falls apart, right? And some people think it's really cool to see a all dilapidated, broken down barn, or do some cool paintings of the dilapidated, broken down barn, right? Well, why is that? Well, because there's all kinds of exterior forces working on it that's changing the form of that barn. Did any of that matter get lost? No. It just changed form. It broke down, and maybe is now part of the dirt. Maybe it's in some termite's belly somewhere, right? Termites came along and ate some of it and used it for energy. So here we have good old Green Arrow from the comics, and there's my other passion, right? As you draw back a bow, what type of potential energy are you using there, drawing back on that bow? Of the three types.
I'm sorry, can you repeat your question?
When you draw back on a bow, what type of potential energy are you using?
Is it the elastic energy?
That would be elastic energy. Yeah, right? So you're drawing back on that elastic energy. At rest, the bow really doesn't have that much potential energy because it's not doing anything, right? If you put an arrow on the string at rest, the arrow is going to fall down. Not much is going to happen, right? Now you draw that bow back and you knock that arrow. What happens when you let go of the string?
It
The
starts to convert into kinetic energy.
Yeah, it's going to convert all that elastic energy and impart it into that arrow and send it flying off. Now, when that arrow strikes that target, is it going to have the same amount of kinetic energy that it had when it left the bow?
No.
No, why? What did it lose it to?
To the potential energy?
Yeah, air is friction. Joe said it. Yeah, air is around it. Right? So there's going to be some air friction there. And then also it's going to hit that target. And when it hits that target, there's going to be friction. So it's going to lose a little bit there as well. But if we could add all of that parts up, we could come back to the amount of potential energy it had, excuse me, back when you drew back the arrow. Does that make sense? And that's where you get into theory of energy.
Mr. McKeever,
Yes.
does everything turn into kinetic energy?
Theoretically, as long if it's moving, yes.
Okay.
Right? My soda sitting here right now theoretically has kinetic energy. What's happening in the soda? Soda's got carbonic acid. There are bubbles,
Okay.
right? So theoretically, there's kinetic energy in there. If you measured, you could actually calculate how much kinetic energy is being lost in that soda because of the bubbles, right? You drink a Coke and the Coke says it has 100 calories. There's a chance you may not get all 100 of those calories because of the bubbles in the Coke. So think that way. Just keep drinking everything that's sugary and say that I'm not getting all of it. As long
That's
as
a good way of thinking it.
Yeah, exactly. Or just eat your food while you're walking, and then you can eat whatever you want because it's moving, so it's got kinetic energy. I'm going to eat, 5 donuts while I'm walking. So we talked about the small air distance the arrow moves multiplied by the average force. Amazing logic, right? Yes. Is going to change things. When you pull that arrow out of that target and you look at it, if you looked at it on an infrared camera, the arrowhead would be warm. Well, there'd be two things that warmed it up. It'd be the friction of the air going around it as it was flying, right? And also the friction imparted when it struck the target and went through the target. Now, what if we fired we're out in space, we draw back on the bow, and we fire an arrow in space? At that point, is that arrow going to keep all of that potential energy from the bow?
I think it will.
It's going to lose a really small part just because of sliding along the actual shaft of the bow, right? Really small part. But most of it, because there's no air in space, there's no air friction. So that arrow is going to continue along until it lands on ET's planet and hits somebody out there and they start an extraterrestrial war with us because somebody shot an arrow in space. And it's funny, they actually calculated out what would happen if you took an archery team to the moon and had them shoot at targets. Well, most of the time they wouldn't be able to hit the target because gravity is so different on the moon, the arrows would actually lift up and go off into space rather than hitting the target. This is actually the way things work like that. So when we look at how energy changes, right, from potential to kinetic, kinetic to friction, friction to potential, all of that, that's the study of the law of conservation of energy, right? So for any system that we're looking at, where it's a pendulum, whether it's an exploding galaxy, the energy doesn't change, right? If we have a star that goes supernova, right, and explodes, which we're hoping that our star never does, at least while we're still alive, right? That would be bad. All of that internal energy of the sun, which is chemical internal potential energy, will now become external kinetic energy. No energy is destroyed, it's now changed. And all that kinetic energy is now going to go out and strike all the planets and probably cause lots of bad things, right? The only thing we don't understand about energy yet is what happens with the black hole. We know that it doesn't disappear, but we just don't know where that energy goes in a black hole. We have a theory, right? We have string theory and stuff like that. We think that the energy gets sucked in and is actually on the inside of that black hole. But we still don't have Matthew McConaughey yet ready to go out and travel through that black hole to find another galaxy. No one gets that. Okay, somebody got that reference. I appreciate it. So wind-up cars. I'm dating myself here because we had these a lot when I was a kid. We didn't have all the cool, we didn't have iPads. You know what we played with when we went outside? Sticks. When I went to school, we walked uphill both ways to school too.
You're not that old.
I'm older than you think. But wind-up cars are a great example of conservation of energy. The wind-up cars have a little spring inside them, right? And that has a key. You take and you turn it. And it's the same thing if you have one of those pullback cars that your kids have, that when you pull it back, you let it go, it goes driving off, right? There's a spring inside of it. You can crank that so far. And if you've ever had one of those cars, eventually you hit a point where it's like click, 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 and it can't go any further, right? You pull that key out, and all of a sudden that spring's elastic energy gets released and gets converted into kinetic energy. So in this case down here, by winding up the string or the spring, we gave this car 10 joules of potential energy, and that would be elastic potential energy. When it went driving off, it ended up with 8 joules of kinetic energy. So we lost 2 of it. What do we lose 2 of it to? Well, these wheels are interacting with the surface, so they're losing energy to friction, right? Which will be given off as heat. The wheels will get a little warmer, and whatever it's riding on will get a little warmer. How could we reduce that loss in friction?
Could you make the surface slanted so it's going downhill?
Good. Okay, good. Right, where it's working with gravity, then against gravity. That would be a great example, right? And that's
make it more slick.
Yeah, make it more slick, right? To a point, because we could make it actually too slick that it gets no traction and just sits there and spins, right? And if you've ever driven on ice, you've experienced that, right? Where you start the car up and your car just goes like this, or in the rain here in Vegas because we have so much oil on the roads.
Would we need to calculate like the friction or the amount of friction that we?
Nope. So with this, so if I was asking you a question like this, I would be giving you how much potential energy the item has, how much kinetic energy was output, and I'd be asking you where did the difference go? What happened? So like if I said 100, it had 100 potential energy joules, and in the end, it finished with 90 potential energy joules. Your answer would be 10 joules of that energy would be lost to
Friction?
Friction.
Yeah.
Is it going to be heat and friction or just always friction?
I mean, theoretically, heat is friction. So,
Okay.
heat's, I mean, there are other forms of heat as well,
Mhm.
but friction is going to create heat. How about that?
So friction's the better answer.
Friction's probably the better answer. Yeah. The more correct answer would be friction,
Okay.
right? And you're not going to get, so don't worry, you're not going to get physics questions on your boards. But let's take this a little differently. So we've got a patient and we're working on doing heel slides with them, right? So heel slides, what the patient's going to do is slide their heel back and forth on the bed, right? And usually they're bending their knee up and they're straightening their knee out. It's a strengthening exercise, especially for somebody that's got a total knee replacement. But the patient is really struggling with it because they're not able to deliver enough energy to overcome the friction of the surface they're on. So maybe they're laying on their bed, their mat, and the mat's kind of that rubbery mat surface that doesn't allow a lot of smooth gliding. What could we do as PTAs to help improve and reduce that friction?
Are they wearing socks
There we go.
already?
We could look at what they're wearing, right? If they've got grippy socks on, that might be the problem, right? The little grippies with the rubbers on the feet so that they don't slide all over the place that you give kids, right? Could also look at, if they're not wearing socks, put a sock on, right? We could change the surface they're sliding on. What if we put them now on a whiteboard? Would that change it?
Yeah.
And a fancy term for whiteboards in physical therapy is powder boards. I love that we call them that. So like the whiteboard I have back here on my wall, I could literally just use that in therapy and call it a powder board, and they'll charge me 10 times as much as they charge me for buying a whiteboard at Staples. Right? But powder board, what the idea is, I can put some talc powder down on that board and that helps the patient sliding. Right? And what you're trying to do is overcome that force. That friction is robbing all of that patient's energy. So we have to find a way to reduce that loss of the friction. That's how this kind of applies to people. I know it seems like it doesn't apply, but it does. I promise you. 5 more minutes to torture you guys with this. So this is looking at that same idea that I talked about, but this is just changing a little bit, looking at that wonderful pendulum device that I talked about that almost all of us psychologists have. Right? When you lift up that pendulum and you pull it up, wherever you stop at that point, that is the maximum amount of potential energy it's going to have. As it swings through, what's going to happen to the potential energy?
Decrease.
Decrease. And then that's going to happen to the kinetic energy.
Increase.
Increase. Good. Until we hit about midway in the pendulum. And then at that point, it's going to start slowing down because it's going against gravity. Until it hits a point out here where it stops again. And when it stops, it's all back to that potential energy. Then what's going to happen?
Swing back.
It's going to go back the other way. Right? Same idea. And that same transfer is going to keep going. But eventually, it's going to come to a stop right here. Why is that? It's going to come to a stop there because of air resistance, right? The friction of air resistance. If you took this same pendulum and you took it up on the outside of the space station, it did the same thing. What would happen?
Pretty much nothing.
It would actually just sit there and swing back and forth forever. Because what's not pulling down on it?
Gravity.
There's no gravity and there's no friction. You would have to impart some of that kinetic energy to it because no gravity's starting it, right? If you pull it here and you let it go, it just kind of float. But if I gave it a little bit of a push, it would just swing back and forth in perpetuity forever and never stop.
Would it change direction though if it's up there since there's no gravity? If you give it a push one way?
I would think it would. That's actually a really good question. So string theory said it would, or string theory would say it would, just because it's going to eventually lose all its connect. But theoretically, actually, no, it would swing the whole way around. So I don't know. That's a good question. We'll add a little bit of gravity. We've got 0.1 G, so it does swing back. There we go. We've got no air, though. That's why with the space station, right? When they launched the space station, they got it out to space. Once they got into space, how did they create gravity on the space station? Does anyone know? They started it spinning. So they created a force. We'll talk about that with centripetal force, which is the next lecture. They created a force by spinning the space station. Once they started that space station spinning, guess what? They really don't have to stop it. It will spin forever in that nice circle, right? Now, if something comes and docks on it like a space shuttle, that changed its mass. That may slow it down, and they've got to adjust for that. But theoretically, once they get that space station spinning, it's just going to spin up there, and they'll have whatever gravity they have, which is not a lot. I don't think I'd want to go to space. I'm already enough of a space case. Oh, here's that picture I was talking about. That person jumping out of the burning building. Sad person. I don't know why they lost. I think that's supposed to be a hat or a purse. I'm not sure what they lost there. But this just kind of shows that example looking at numbers wise. So the person up here has 10,000 joules of potential energy. As they fall, that potential energy gets less and less until they get to the bottom where all of that potential energy has now become kinetic. Now, if these firemen down here suddenly pulled a fast one and said, psych, and pulled that trampoline out from under, what would happen to that person? Kersplat. Right? That'd be bad. We don't want to do that. Now, let me ask a question. With them pulling on that trampoline, how much energy are they going to have to pull with? Enough to overcome what?
Kinetic energy?
Yeah, enough to overcome her kinetic energy.
But can that also cause like for that person to like bounce off too if they pulled it too deep?
What happens if instead of pulling with 10,000 joules, they're now pulling with 12,000 joules?
She won't hit the floor too hard?
Yeah, well, theoretically, it'll cause them to bounce a little harder because they've increased the elasticity of that trampoline. Right? If you look, when they do those trampolines, there's a little bit of sag, right? Because they want just under how much energy that person's going to put into it. And again, they don't stand there and go, the person weighs 455 pounds. No, they don't calculate it. They could, right? But from experience, especially people that do this, they can pretty much guess about how high the person up is, how much tension they have to put on that to keep the person from A, falling through it, and B, hitting it so hard and bouncing that they didn't do any good anyway because they're going to fly off and hit a tree or something. But yeah, we could. I mean, theoretically, if they pulled too much on it, they could cause her to bounce off and go over here and cause more damage. Or worse, have that be so hard, it's almost as hard as the ground and cause further bodily damage.
Wait, Mr. McKeever, so you're saying that they would have to pull enough to give it more energy than what she's going to be putting?
So ideally, what they're going to do is they would at least have to pull with the same amount of kinetic energy she's going to impart. At least. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Now, most of the time, they're not going to pull. If say this person's 10,000 joules here, they'll probably pull with like 9,900 joules, and they don't calculate it either. They'll leave a little bit for sag. Because if it's fully firm again, it's going to hurt. Right? You want a little bit, and you want a little bit of a rebound effect, but you don't want her hitting this, that it's so firm that she hits it and ends up over here. Right? That would be bad. Or worse yet, here's the fire truck. She hits this, splats into the side of the fire truck. That would be bad. Right? And I still, I couldn't imagine having this choice of either burning or jumping out of a building. That's not something I ever want to think about. I don't know if I could make that choice. Right? So each atom that we have makes up a bundle of energy. Right? All of our bodies is made up of complex carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, everything like that. So we're made up of everything. When those nuclear atoms rearrange themselves, enormous amounts of energy can be released. That's how we get something like nuclear energy. Whereas I think George Bush used to call it nuclear energy, right? Nuclear energy provides a ton of energy for a very small amount of material. Like 1 gram of plutonium can power just about as much as I think 27,000 tons of coal. But why don't we use more nuclear energy? What's the problem with it?
Isn't it really unstable?
Can be unstable, good, that's part of it. We've gotten a little better at that nowadays, right? We're past the nuclear meltdown stages at this point, thankfully. Yeah, right, once we've used up that uranium, it becomes radioactive waste, right? And we still haven't figured out what the heck do we do with it. Does anyone know what we do with radioactive waste right now in the United States?
Put it in barrels and bury it in the ground.
Yeah, where at?
There's like a town, and I can't remember.
Yucca. Isn't it
Yucca
Yucca
Mountain?
Mountain?
Yep, Yucca Mountain. Yep,
I
you
took
got
a
it.
tour. I took a tour of Yucca Mountain. It's actually pretty cool.
It is pretty cool. They teach you a
Yeah.
lot up there too.
Yeah.
But in reality, you know, what I was at, it's 80 miles outside of Vegas, I think, or something like that. Something, maybe it's closer, I don't know. But just think about it, like all of our nuclear waste is basically stored just north of us. That's how The Hills Have Eyes happened. That movie, just kidding. Every time I drive that road, that's one of the things I think of, right? I just want to get through this slide and I'll give you a break real quick. But what happens is that nuclear atom breaks down. And when it breaks down, it releases a tremendous amount of heat. We use that heat to heat up water. That water heats up, it turns propellers, it creates energy. Yeah, I think they do. Anne asked if they give you a warning about how long you can stay. They don't keep you there all day, that's for sure. But most of it's stored underground, so you're pretty safe. Right? He came back without being able to climb walls. No nuclear spiders bit him, so he's okay.
Yeah, I think I'm okay. I don't know. But it was only like an hour long and we didn't go to the actual nuclear waste, so.
Yeah. Where's the closest nuclear plant to Vegas? Does anyone know? Because we do have one close to us. Palo Verde. It's down outside of Phoenix. It's a nuclear facility that provides energy to Phoenix and some of southern Arizona and also to California as well. It's run by the University of Arizona. They can give you tours of that too, which is that's really cool. If you ever get a chance for that, those tours are pretty sweet. That was neat to see. And I come from an area that has 3 nuclear plants, so there's nothing wrong with me at all. But that's how the sun warms us, right? The sun has many nuclear explosions all over it. It shoots off heat in the form of radiant waves. Those strike the earth, right? Right now, are the radiant waves hitting us as well right now? No, because we're in winter. They're not hitting us as directly. They're kind of oblique, so we're not as warm as we were over summer. Over summer, those rays kind of beat down on us, right? It gets warm here. All right, let's give you a break there. We'll talk about the rest of energy. It's okay if we're behind. I have days built in to be behind, so don't freak out. They had one of you like, we're a little bit behind. Don't worry about it. I've got that figured in.